Welcome to The Atlantic at Sundance. I'm Shirley Lee, a staff writer with The Atlantic, and I'm so excited to be moderating today's discussion about the documentary Free Chol Soo Lee. The documentary examines the roller coaster life story of Chol Soo Lee, a Korean immigrant wrongfully convicted of murder who inspired a movement to free him. Joining me now are the film's co-directors and co-producers, Julie Ha and Eugene Yi, as well as the activist and film narrator, Sebastian Yoon. Thank you all for being here today. Let's jump
Thanks
right
for
in.
having us.
Thank you so
Of
much for
course.
having us. It's great to be here.
Julie and Eugene, I want to start with you. The Free Chol Soo Lee movement crested nearly 50 years ago, and his story had been covered in a 1983 documentary called Perceptions, A Question of Justice, and reinterpreted by Hollywood in a drama called True Believer. What motivated the two of you to take another look at Chol Soo's life story after his release, now? And what was important to you about his life after his initial incarceration?
We've actually, Eugene and I have actually known about this story for quite some time. We heard about it from the journalist K.W. Lee, whose series of stories helped trigger the movement to free Chol Soo Lee. And he's actually quite an influential figure in both of our lives. For me personally, he inspired me to become a journalist. But I would say the idea to actually make a film out of this story didn't really get planted until I attended the funeral of Chol Soo Lee. In 2014, and there was just there was sort of this overwhelming sense of heaviness at the funeral, and it was attended by many of the activists who had come to help Chol Soo Lee decades earlier, and they were expressing such deep regret that they didn't do enough to save him, even though they devoted years of their lives to trying to free him from death row. And K.W. Lee was also there, and he wondered why this story was still underground after all these years, even though it was a landmark movement. And so that heaviness actually stayed with me for a long time after. So Eugene and I have worked together as journalists, and we wanted to work on a film together. And I told him about this heaviness about a year after the funeral, and we knew we had to explore what was behind it. And it literally felt like the story was beckoning us, and it needed a release. And just getting back to what you said about True Believer, that was also a motivation in terms of, in that film, obviously Hollywood recognized the inherent drama in this story, and that's why they made that film. But who got to be the heroes, who got to be the saviors? It was the white defense lawyers, played by James Woods and Robert Downey Jr. But what about the Asian Americans in this film? The hard-charging investigative reporter who came in and broke this case wide open. What about the movement of Asian Americans, young and old, who rallied to Chol Soo's cause and overturned 2 murder convictions? In True Believer, we Asian Americans were not allowed to play those roles, even though that's the truth of what happened. In our film, we felt like we have a chance actually to not only excavate this very important story and tell this history, but also for us to assert Asian Americans we deserve and will take our rightful places in a truthful telling of our story.
Absolutely. Eugene, I wonder if you have anything to add?
Just one thing. I mean, Julie spoke about kind of the way that the story was perceived outside the Asian American community, but even within the Asian American community, the story was just completely unknown. I mean, this happened years before the Vincent Chin incident, which is much better known within the Asian American community itself. And so this also felt like something that we wanted to dig into. I mean, why was this story still unknown? I mean, this incredible movement led by a coalition of immigrant and second, third generation Asian Americans was able to get this guy off of death row who had 2 murder convictions on him. I mean, this isn't something that just happens. It's a huge victory for the Asian American community, yet it remained unknown for so many people, and we just wanted to dig into why that might be the case.
So, as you mentioned, Julie, Chol Soo passed away in 2014. You attended his funeral. But his words are heard throughout the film, gathered from his memoir and his other writings. Now, Sebastian, you are the narrator of the film, and I wanted to direct this question to you. What did it mean for you to get the offer to be the narrator. You're not a voice actor, and what was it like getting that offer, and what did it mean for you to read Chol Soo's words?
I would say I was both excited and feeling very privileged because I'm part of a documentary series called College Behind Bars, produced by Ken Burns and directed by Lynn Novick. And I've engaged in numerous public speaking activities since my release from prison in 2019. And I was always regretful of the fact that I saw very little Asian Americans in the audience whenever I had conversations about social justice reform or criminal justice reform. And when Soo Kim, the producer of this film, reached out to me, it excited me because I thought it was going to be an interesting opportunity for Asian Americans to kind of put out a narrative that we also belong in conversations surrounding criminal justice reform. So I wanted to get a sense of the film and what the story is. So I watched the film, and when I agreed to be the narrator of this film, it was an honor, but it was also a huge responsibility. I felt the responsibility come from the notion that there is someone who was wrongfully convicted of a crime he did not commit, and then upon being released after 10 years, society demanded and expected so many things from him. And when he failed to achieve, the ideals of society, I didn't want people to judge him in a manner that was negative to his character and without understanding the true trauma and pain that he must have gone through prison that might have led to his actions.
Hmm. Yeah, to go off of that, what about your experience in the prison system perhaps informed your narration? You provide such genuine emotion to his words. And I'm wondering what you drew from in your experience that you really wanted to highlight as part of his story.
Yeah, interestingly, when I read the memoir, I think that's when I got really a very good sense of who Chol Soo Lee was. And a lot of the things that he had experienced in prison was very similar to mine in terms of the search procedures and going through the criminal justice reform criminal justice system, and
Mhm.
some of the experiences that he had with violence, although it was not to the same degree as me. It was much more violent back then. At the same time, currently, if we watch films around prison or incarcerated individuals, we see like the stereotypical image of someone who is violent and undeserving of redemption and forgiveness, someone who ought to stay in prison. And
Mhm.
I was hoping that my narration, by telling people or showing people that what Chol Soo Lee experienced in prison was not just violence and gang life, it was loneliness and hopelessness that people have to deal with when they are incarcerated. And these things have
Mhm.
lasting damage on people's minds and hearts. And I
Mhm.
think we often forget to consider the mental health aspect of someone who's come out of prison and the assistance that one might need when they are released from prison.
Not to harp on True Believer too much, but I want to go back to something you said earlier, Julie, about how Hollywood immediately erased a lot of the important Asian American activists who were involved in this movement. So, Julie and Eugene, how did you decide which figures in Chol Soo's life to highlight? I'm thinking of Ranko Yamada, for instance, who kind of serves as the audience proxy. Julie, you mentioned KW Lee, who also plays a prominent role. Um, and how did you decide who would have the voices in this film?
That was that was very difficult because it was as one of our activists says, Ju, it was a chorus, it wasn't a solo, and so there were many incredible activists who helped Chol Soo Lee, but we did have to make some choices, and I think we always knew KW Lee and Ranko Yamada would be key figures, because they had very close relationships with Chol Soo Lee, and very unique relationships. KW Lee, obviously, he became, uh, he says like sort of Chol Soo's hope when there was no hope, when we took an interest in his case and then decided to investigate and write about it. Um, And so he actually ended up even becoming a father figure to Chol Soo Lee. So we knew that that was definitely an important character. And then Ranko Yamada, she actually knew Chol Soo like before he was arrested for this crime, and she worked actually even long before there was a movement. She tried on her own to raise money to hire him a defense attorney. I think she was turned down by like 10 attorneys, because she couldn't pay them enough to try to help him. Even progressive attorneys, who said that this wasn't a political cause, it wasn't political enough for them to get involved. And so, we knew that these were just incredible, human beings through which we could sort of, I think, come to understand Chol Soo Lee, and that, they would obviously have such an empathetic personal lens through which to view Chol Soo Lee and to understand him. But we don't want to, I think we don't want to undercut the value of all the activists, including those who are not featured in our film. It's not because they weren't worthy, but we just had to make some difficult choices about who we selected.
And I just want to add, I think part of it was also because of the pandemic as well. I mean, we wanted to speak with so many people, but once everything shut down, it just wasn't a risk that we were willing to take. So that really put us in a position where we had to start working with what we had and really embrace the archival footage that we had as the approach to telling the story that we wanted to tell. So as Julie said, it led to some difficult and really heartbreaking choices about who we could not talk to. But really the most important thing for us, I think, was that this film really had to have that intimacy. Like, we never wanted to make a traditional historical documentary or biopic. We wanted to make sure that the closeness that people had to Chol Soo Lee was really expressed. And we hope that comes across in the choices that we made.
Yeah, Eugene, I was about to ask about that archival footage. You ended up discovering a lot of tapes, and also I believe the interviews that K.W. Lee conducted as a father figure later in Chol Soo's life are also incorporated in this film. For Julie and Eugene, for the two of you, I'd love to hear about how your journalism background informed this atypical structural choice for this documentary, because it doesn't feel like a biopic. It's not going through the timeline in a straightforward manner. You didn't hire a voice actor again. And just, how did you, speaking as a journalist, how did you decide the structure from the lead on?
Well, it started with just trying to see what was available of Chol Soo Lee. And once we decided to make a film of the story, we reached out to K.W. Lee, excuse me, who we've both known for some time, and who's Julie's journalism mentor, of course. And he really opened a lot of doors for us in terms of introducing us to a lot of the people who were involved either as activists or as journalists at the time covering the story. And as we spoke to each person, we were amazed by what we discovered, because everybody had kept something. This was such an important moment, a seminal moment, an influential moment in all of their lives, that they all had a box, right? They all had a box in the garage or an attic somewhere. And as we went from person to person, it was almost as if we were unearthing this just sort of unofficial archive, or this underground archive of all this incredible material of Chol Soo, including the video material that you saw, including the audio tapes that you mentioned. And so really that was the root. And then kind of once we decided to really embrace archival footage and this sort of archival approach as our aesthetic, that required us to sort of pare back on the modern day footage that we had, because we do have footage where, like we went to Chinatown with KW, for example, and walked around. He kind of explained stuff to us. But when we started to pare that material away, we saw that the archival was shining in a way that it wasn't before, and it was really immersive. And it allowed us to really let the archival speak to us and take us to a form that felt like it made sense for the story.
Yeah, if I also could add, since Eugene and I are like first-time directors, and it's actually my first time even working on a film at all. We couldn't have done this without a lot of help, obviously. And so I just want to make sure we credit our incredible team, because you don't get to Sundance without having an incredible team behind you. And it's, our producers, Soo Kim, Jean Shen, Sona Jo. I mean, they brought all their experience and expertise and incredible insights about our story that I think were just amazing to us, even though we've worked on the story for 6 years. And that helped us tremendously to really develop and understand and challenge ourselves about what the story is, so that we could make this final film, which we're very proud of. I also want to say, we brought in an archival producer once we got some funding, and his name is Brian Becker, and he's just a master at his craft as well. And so we were just really fortunate that we had this team together so that we could make a film like this.
And I also just want to mention the rest of our editing team, Anita Yu and or Alda Velasco and Anita Yu, who, along with Jean Chen, were just instrumental in structuring the film and just getting us to really the core of what the story is.
Yeah, it's absolutely a team effort, much like the movement itself, which I want to rewind a bit and go back to, the movement that sparked in the Pan-Asian community in the 1970s. There are so many elements to Chol Soo's story that resonate particularly for Asian American viewers. It's challenging the model minority myth. Sebastian, you spoke about the isolation. Obviously, the case began because of racial profiling. Hollywood whitewashed the story. Anyway, I'm wondering for all of you, what was the element for you as journalists and Asian American activists? What was the element that most inspired you to dive into this story as much as you did?
Sebastian, did you want to go first?
For me, it was a lot of pain involved in working with this film, and part of the reason why I love this film so much is that the entire team was very emotionally invested in it. I remember during our recording sessions, we had to go through several emotional points where we felt like a family. We even shed tears together, and it felt like this documentary was not only telling the story of Chol Soo Lee, but our story. And it was through his voice that we were able to kind of narrate the experience of an Asian American growing up in the United States. And I'm just very privileged that I was able to work with this incredible team and this film.
I just want to build on something Sebastian said, and just highlight the fact that this, Sebastian didn't just come in and give voice to Chol Soo. It was a collaboration. We were at a point in working on the film where we always wanted to get Chol Soo's voice in there, but it was difficult for us. We weren't able to break through in terms of kind of really getting to the heart of who he was in a way that I think once we started working with Sebastian, we actually worked on the script together and he gave us suggestions. And it was really this collaboration that I feel like gave heart to Chol Soo's story and his voice and his character in the way that he exists in the film, in a way that we just would never have been able to do. So it's just, we just are so privileged to have worked with Sebastian as well. And it was just, we just hope that the final product reflects that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me personally, I actually probably wanted to make this film for very personal reasons at first, because K.W. Lee is my longtime mentor and inspired me to become a journalist. And when I saw him in such pain after Chol Soo died, because K.W. didn't expect to outlive Chol Soo, I think I wanted to comfort my mentor. And I didn't want to allow this story to remain underground because it was too important. And then I would say this too. I think, though, as we've worked on this film for more than 6 years, I've come to make some discoveries for myself. And one thing I thought about actually toward the end of our edit of the film was that the heaviness I felt at the funeral of Chol Soo Lee, which I used to believe was the regret from the activists and KW who felt like maybe they didn't do enough to save him, and they needed some kind of catharsis and release, and that this film could serve that. I'm realizing now that that heaviness was partly that of Chol Soo Lee too, and we really believe that he wouldn't want the legacy of his life and this incredible movement he inspired to be one of regret and pain and sadness. And so I think, for me personally, like the film became about also providing a release for Chol Soo Lee and being able to continue the legacy of the movement that he inspired. And, that legacy is really up to all of us, those of us who are still living, and what we're going to do once we learn about this story.
Shirley, if I may add, I think that
Mhm.
the timing of this film is very important too, because after COVID struck, there has been a lot of violence and discrimination against AAPIs, Asian American Pacific Islanders, and the national narrative has largely excluded us from conversations, and we continue to fight to escape this identity of being the model minority, the identity of being the other as the perpetual foreigner. And my hope is that when people watch this film, they don't see just a Korean American person. I want them, or I hope that they see an individual who has been marginalized, who has been excluded from this country, from mainstream media. I want them to see the suffering and the hopelessness that he experienced in prison as a result of the very broken criminal justice system. And I hope they also see that the power of community support could be incredible and have tremendous impact in society and the directions of someone's life. And my hope is that through empathy, we can start working together to decrease marginalization in this country, to decrease discrimination and violence amongst each other, and work toward building a multiracial democracy and harmony. And I think this film does a really good job of possibly starting conversations in the future.
Absolutely. Something I remember being really struck by while watching this film was toward the end, seeing Chol Soo talk about what he thinks his legacy might be, and that existential question of, did you live up to being a symbol, and what was the point of all this? And I remember reading about how his life seemed controversial because he ended up back in prison, right? And this story really explodes the notion of who he was and who Chol Soo Lee was in the context of this larger movement. So you have answered this to an extent, but I would really love to hear a little bit more about what this making this film for more than 6 years now has illuminated for you. All of you have touched on this a bit, but what out of everything that you've learned, all of this footage you gathered, all of the words that you heard, has illuminated for you as as part of your Asian American identity, perhaps, or something else?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you phrase it, or that you bring up this question of meaning, because I think there's a lot of that imbued in this film. I mean, there's a moment later in the film where when Chol Soo is at his lowest, where KW reaches out to him in a letter and just sort of talks about how they're all just bound together for better or worse, if our fleeting existence means anything at all. And those questions have to have emerged for not just Chol Soo and KW, but for all the activists. Just what does this all mean? What we've all been through, this journey that they all shared together. And I think for me, it's been touched upon by Julie and Sebastian already, but that empathy, that compassion, the connections that we make with community and with each other are what stay with us. And whether that's in a political context or a personal context, as Asian Americans in this particular moment, I think that's just something that continues to stay with me and just inform how I go through my days.
And Julie?
Yeah, I just want to affirm everything that Sebastian Eugene said. I guess touching upon what I said earlier, sometimes when we look at Chol Soo's life, it is quite tragic. And I remember Eugene and I at one point were wanting to make sure that people don't draw from our film that you could work so hard and with so much compassion and humanity in collective action, and then you don't have the outcome you want in terms of how Chol Soo's life turned out. But again, we realize the story doesn't have to end there. That in a way, our film could be a continuation of the legacy, and that it's really up to all of those of us who are still living how the story ends. After learning this history, how will we allow it to move us? To inspire us, to want to become more compassionate, kind beings. And how will we allow it to change us and how we see the world and our roles in it in creating a more just society. And so we saw that. I'll also say just Sebastian actually, his involvement in our film actually also changed a lot of the meaning for me as well. And and he just joined us actually just this past fall. But I think the whole team would agree that it was quite transformative for us because, he not only was able to humanize Chol Soo Lee in a way that we had really hoped to do, but Eugene and I felt like, it was very hard to do since we never got to interview him ourselves. And just, Sebastian just really, digging into reading Chol Soo's memoir and his looking at his interviews, and then feeling like he could identify him in some way, and then putting him in a position where he had to revisit trauma, but was willing to do that in order to serve Chol Soo Lee and make sure that people could understand him and view him in an empathetic way. I think for me that just sort of made me see our story in a different way, and that that we could really center Chol Soo Lee's voice and make sure he had a chance to explain to all the people who supported him how hard it was to live a normal life and to live up to the expectations of the community, even though he actually, I think he wanted to. I think he wanted to give them the fairy tale ending, but for then now the film with Sebastian's help to be able to explain how hard that is, I think that was really an important thing that we were able to do with Sebastian's help.
Shirley, if I just could add, I think one of the problems with this country and the reason Asian Americans continue to fight to escape the identity of the other is because Asian American history is not taught in schools. We need to do more of that. And what this film has illustrated for me is that nothing brings communities closer together when an injustice occurs and they band together to fight against it. And Chol Soo Lee's case showcases that. And, MLK said this, and I paraphrase, but injustice here is an injustice there. And I hope that we take this concept, and when we see an injustice occur, whether it's in the Asian American community, whether it's the Black community or the Brown community, we are able to say this is wrong, and then we can band together, not just as a singular community of Asian Americans, but BIPOC communities coming together to stand and fight against injustice. And I think that is what we need in this country in order to make sure that equity is met and that people are treated fairly and equally across the board.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to leave on that note. We're running out of time. Julie, Eugene, and Sebastian, thank you all so much for joining us today. To read more of our stories and to subscribe to The Atlantic, please visit theatlantic.com/culture. And you can check out more of our coverage at Sundance right here on The Atlantic's YouTube page and on the Sundance Film Festival's virtual Main Street. Thank you.